Hello and welcome to the Yak, the wide receiver podcast. I'm Big Italy 42 here with Josh Shepardson at BChad50, and we're talking about some top plays for wide receiver for you for this week. And obviously, lots of good content or lots of good plays still, and one who's just criminally underpriced still, especially on DraftKings. Alshon Jeffrey, a guy that really everybody is looking at as a relative value considering his recent production and his upside. So this is a guy, if you're making cash games, GPPs, anything on DraftKings, got to be one of the first guys you consider.
Yeah, the volume's been unreal, and he's turning that volume into production. For the year, he leads all qualified receivers with 123 yards receiving per game. And it's remarkable, but that number goes up if you throw out his first game of the year when he was playing with a nagging injury. Over the last 3 games that he's played since he's gotten healthy, he's been targeted 42 times, so that's an average of 14 targets per game. He has 27 receptions, which is more than 9 receptions per game, and has 414 yards receiving, which is good for 138 yards receiving per game. And he's got a couple of touchdowns just for good measure. So, the guy's doing it all. He's been a monster. He's unstoppable. He is beating up on good defenses, bad defenses. It does not matter. He's just a matchup nightmare. His size makes him as a red zone threat, and there's really nothing anybody can do to stop him. And his price at DraftKings, that's just begging to be owned.
Yeah, it's almost like here it is, just take it kind of thing. And you probably should, at least in your cash games. Demaryius Thomas next up, facing off against the Kansas City team that if you've been paying attention this year, you know one of the worst defenses in football, especially against wide receivers. And surprising, given all the talent on this defense, it's kind of been the opposite of what it was the last few years. But either way, we like to exploit advantages, and Peyton Manning has looked terrible at times, but he's still managed to get the ball to his top 2 guys a reasonable amount. Last week, Sanders was the one catching a long touchdown. Thomas didn't quite have all the yardage we would like or the red zone looks, but Thomas is still a guy that has massive upside. And just due to his size and ability alone, there's nobody on this Kansas City team that can cover him down the field.
Yeah, and the nice thing about a guy like Thomas is that he's such a freak after the catch. Fitting that he's an elite play on the Yak podcast, because this is a guy that doesn't need Peyton to have that strong arm anymore. He'll catch these bubble screens and break a tackle, and goodbye, it's off to the races. The only real knock on his line this year is the fact that he's only reached the end zone once, but otherwise, this is vintage DT. He's getting a lot of targets, he's reeling in a lot of receptions, totaling a lot of yardage. He's got 10 receptions of over 20 yards this year, so, the guy can really put yardage up in a hurry. The touchdown outage this year, the fact that he's only got one, it seems very fluky, and that should correct itself at some point. And as you noted, the Chiefs cannot defend receivers. They're allowing the most DraftKings and most FanDuel points per game to opposing wide receivers. So DT, pretty easy choice. And the only knock that I have on him is the fact that Emmanuel Sanders could fight him for some looks. But the fact is, both of those guys have gotten plenty of targets and looks this year. And even if Peyton spreads the ball around, it's going to be mostly to those two. So I feel good about both of them having a good game. But Thomas has been the more targeted option there. He's a big receiver. And outside of the touchdown grabs, he bests Emmanuel Sanders across the board. So I'll take DT to a teammate.
Yeah, I'm a big fan there. Stephon Diggs, the guy who's been popular over the past few weeks, now facing off against an Oakland team that knew Antonio Brown was going to catch the football. He continued to catch the football. He caught it a little bit more. And then they let him have even more last week. And obviously, Diggs is nowhere near the caliber of player that Antonio Brown is. Maybe he will be one day. He's not now. He's a rookie. But he's been good. And this is a defense that's giving up a ton of yards through the air. And Stephon Diggs has been a guy who's been he's made some incredible plays. Diving, touchdown grab, some sharp cuts to lose some defenders. So this is a guy that's got a decent floor. And, he's got big upside despite the fact that, he's really the only weapon in that offensive passing attack.
Yeah, and people who used him last week certainly had to be disappointed, but when you're talking about his floor being last week so far through his first 5 games, 3 receptions for 42 yards isn't exactly a total dud. The guy is making plays at this point, and obviously from a fantasy perspective that you need more, but for the year, he's averaging 9 targets a game, 5.6 receptions per game, and 92.2 yards receiving per game, and that includes last week's stinker. So the guy's been putting up numbers. He's getting volume, and as you noted, the Raiders knew that Antonio Brown was going to get the football, especially early when he just kept getting the football and couldn't do anything. Diggs as you noted again, not Antonio Brown caliber player, but when you can't take a receiver away and you know the football's coming to him, makes me feel pretty good about another guy who's a pretty obvious volume guy in Diggs. Going to get a lot of targets from Teddy Bridgewater. Good luck taking him away. They just couldn't take away the number one from the Steelers, and it's going to be, I think, more of the same this week. Not to the same Antonio Brown extent, but I would be surprised to see Diggs go for 100 yards or at least near that, and I think he's a fairly safe play. And the nice thing about last week's down by Stephon Diggs standards at this point is the fact that his price got a nice drop again. I mean, a few $100s knocked off on each side. He was already underpriced anyway. The fact that he had that price knocked down again after just one bad showing is kind of laughable, but I'll take the discount and gladly apply it to Stephon Diggs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said with the Vikings, I mean, that play with the Raiders, I think it was 20 to 22 seconds left in that game. That final pass play, I mean, it was a crossing route across the middle to Antonio Brown. Not only did they kind of know the ball was going to him, they were backed off in coverage, they still couldn't keep him from getting another 40 yards after the catch. I mean, this defense it's terrible. So I'm with you there. Diggs with a nice high ceiling here as well. On the opposite side of this game, Michael Crabtree, the best receiver that nobody's talking about this season. You and I have been mentioning him for a couple weeks as a crazy good value. Has gotten a little bit of a price bump, but that's probably because he caught 7 balls for 108 yards and 2 touchdowns last week against the Steelers. And granted, Minnesota is a decent defense. They're an above-average defense, but Crabtree, everyone wants to talk about Amari Cooper and pay thousands of dollars more for him each week when, he generally has a higher ceiling, but Crabtree's been the more consistent player this year.
Crabtree actually bests Amari Cooper in targets, receptions, receiving touchdowns, and Cooper only holds the edge over him in receiving yards, remarkably. You never know by the average. Everybody's gushing over Amari Cooper, and that's to take nothing away from Cooper. Cooper's been fantastic, but Crabtree is the unsung hero on his own team. I mean, he's not getting enough pub for receivers that play for the Raiders, let alone receivers around the NFL. He's grossly underpriced, under 1,000 on DraftKings, under 6,500 on FanDuel. Easy to budget for, much tougher than the Vikings this week, but with recent run of production, I mean, I don't care that it's not an ideal cushy matchup. Over the last 3 games, he's got 20 receptions on 32 targets for 273 yards. He's averaging 91 yards receiving per game and over 10 targets per game over the last 3. So to say he's put his injury in the rearview mirror, last year looks like it was just kind of a rebound year, getting his legs back under him. This year he looks like a guy who banked on himself this year, signing a 1-year contract. Gonna be pretty happy that he did that come this offseason when he gets paid.
Yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, he's always been a productive receiver. His problem always been lack of quarterback play, really, with a lot of guys that are struggling who are now no longer starters. Well, we'll leave him out of this one. Speaking of starting quarterbacks, one that I love, Brian Hoyer, throwing to one of the better receivers in the league, DeAndre Hopkins this week against my team. So I'm kind of conflicted here, but I guess Brian Hoyer's going to take a back seat for this one for me. But DeAndre Hopkins, as we've seen all year, recently hasn't gotten talked about much, but he was on a hell of a pace here early in the season. Really, the injury to Arian Foster does hurt this offense, but he's still an elite receiver. And while the Bengals do have some guys that are pretty good in coverage, they have struggled against number 1 receivers, and it doesn't get any more obvious number 1 than DeAndre Hopkins with the Texans.
Yeah, I mean, he's coming off of his bye week, yet he still ranks 2nd in the league in targets. So, I mean, that pretty much speaks volumes about how frequently Brian Hoyer, or actually even before that, Ryan Mallett, was airing the football out to him. He's 4th in receiving yards per game at 108.8. The guy has been targeted a minimum of 11 times in every single contest this year. Wow. You don't raise a floor much higher than that by getting 11 targets per game. His low water mark for receiving yards in a contest this year is 50. He has one other 53-yard effort. Beyond that, he's gone over 90 in every other game this year. The guy is just a model of consistency. He's got 6 touchdown grabs to boot. I mean, he can do it all. The ceiling is really high. The floor is really high. And the game flow should work in his favor this week with the Bengals double-digit favorites and the Texans visiting and on the road. They're going to have to air it out. It's going to have to be the new cop show.
Yeah, and I certainly have faith in Brian Hoyer, and I know some other people do as well. So, Emmanuel Sanders next up. We already kind of touched on the Chiefs being inadequate on defense, the fact that Demaryius Thomas, generally more of the deep ball threat, more of the yards after the catch guy, but Sanders, despite not being the physical force that Demaryius Thomas is, I mean, he's an elite catcher underneath. He can catch the ball deep, as we saw last week. He could do it all. I mean, he could be a volume guy as well. You could easily see both these guys with 10-plus catches in a given game. So he's a guy that is certainly on my radar as well.
Yeah, the beauty of the way this Broncos offense is this year is that DT can be the main guy, and this still leaves plenty of touches for Emmanuel Sanders because nobody else has stepped up as even a viable third option to really threaten either of those two. So while Thomas is getting his, Sanders is still getting his, and with the Chiefs ranking dead last in terms of giving up the most fantasy points to receivers this year, I say go ahead and take a flyer on both of them because both should get a steady diet of targets and a steady diet of production this week.
Yeah, and Peyton Manning's had plenty of success against this team in the past too, so maybe an interesting stack. I haven't had much Peyton Manning in the last really 2 months, but
me either.
This might be the week where I throw him in a GPP or two, so we'll see. Speaking of a guy who's been a great GPP play, really a pretty good cash game play as well most weeks, Allen Robinson went to Revis Island last week, like you mentioned, and didn't do too badly for himself. And this guy has emerged as, I mean, he's big, he's strong, he's fast, he's got good hands. Blake Bortles, a lot of work to be done there. He's inaccurate, doesn't make the best decisions at times, but he throws the ball a ton because this is not a good running attack. So that's always good for a guy like Allen Robinson, who's a big downfield threat. And he's going to see volume here once again against a Baltimore defense that we would be kind if we said that this is a bad defense.
Yeah, it's pretty safe to say that they don't have a Revis in their secondary. They don't have anything even resembling of a Revis in their secondary. They've had no answer for receivers this year. Allen Robinson's been a target machine. Both of the Allens have been really good for the Jaguars. Allen Hurns has also been productive, but Robinson has outpaced him in targets and receptions, receiving yards. They're tied for the team lead in touchdown receptions. Both are getting theirs. The reason that I like Robinson in GPP is a little bit more than Hurns, in addition to having a higher floor just because he gets a higher volume. I think the fact that there's a pretty sizable price gap on DraftKings is going to bump up Hurns' value, Hurns' ownership just a little bit while depressing Robinson's, because it's a little bit easier to budget for a guy like Allen Hurns, who's almost $1,000 cheaper, I believe. On FanDuel, it's only a $100 price gap, so Robinson will probably end up higher owned than Hurns there, but it's going to be pretty close on DraftKings. And in this case, I'd rather have the better receiver there, and the fact that he's going to probably get a little bit of a bite taken out of his ownership, it's just a bonus for GPP purposes, and it's remarkable. But talk about underrated receivers, and everybody wants to talk about that 2004 rookie receiver class, and when does Allen Robinson's name ever come up? It's OBJ, it's Mike Evans last year, it's Sammy Watkins last week, it's all these other receivers, but Allen Robinson's part of that ridiculously loaded receiving class, and yet he just never gets the pub that he deserves.
That's what happens when you put on that little that two-tone Jaguars helmet. Nobody cares about you outside of Jacksonville and outside of fantasy, but we both care about Allen Robinson. I'll certainly be caring about him this week in my lineups. Next up, a guy that I did not have in my lineups last week, but had the breakout game we've all been expecting for, I don't know if I can count that many days before the end of this podcast, but a lot of days. Jordan Matthews, you mentioned, we were talking before the show, how Sam Bradford's been raving about him, and he's always been talented. He's always been a physical force. He's got tremendous body control. We saw some ridiculous catches he made last year on the sideline, things of that nature. So the talent's never been the issue. It's been the confidence. It's been the drops, but he does have big-time upside, and I mean, he's the obvious number one option for Sam Bradford here.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan Matthews, another second-year receiver. Had a pretty good rookie season. Expectations were that he'd kick it up to another notch this year. Hasn't quite done so in terms of what expectations were. Not quite living up to those just yet, but still paces the Eagles easily in targets, receptions, receiving yards. And even though he only has 2 touchdown grabs, it's actually tied for the team lead. So he's really leading across the board in receiving categories for the Eagles, and looked good last week, and gets an even softer matchup this week. The Miami Dolphins, after getting barbecued by my boy Sammy Watkins. I mean, we talk about how it was obvious that the Steelers were going to target Antonio Brown last week when they just kept throwing to him. Tyrod Taylor threw 12 passes last week. 8 of them were to Sammy Watkins. All 8 were reeled in by Sammy Watkins. The Dolphins had no doubt where the football was going, and Brent Grimes put up less of a fight than his wife has in recent weeks. And now he gets Jordan Matthews. I'm expecting another good old-fashioned barbecue job on Brent Grimes this week, and I think Matthews is going to take him to the woodshed.
Yeah. I mean, it's at that point, it's if whether or not Sam Bradford can get the ball to him. It looked like he could last week. Hopefully that continues this week, but definitely going to be a great target for your GPPs. And that's going to wrap things up for us here. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Lots of other great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.